Good morning and a very warm welcome to this plenary session where our focus, again under the theme of Rethinking Europe, will be on political governance. Yesterday we talked about peace and tomorrow we are focusing on solidarity, and all these things connected because one of the issues that we discussed yesterday, particularly in our opening ceremony, was that question of rebuilding trust in Europe and how to do it. That was mentioned by our opening speakers. There was also talk about opinion polls showing that for European citizens, peace isn't taken for granted. It is a very important aspect of how they see the EU for citizens in many countries. So we'll play into this debate. But crucially this morning, what we would like to focus on is the European elections. In 6 days' time, I say 6 days because countries like my own have a peculiar anomaly and we refuse to vote on the same day as everyone else in Europe. So we vote next Thursday, so it starts in 6 days' time. Voters across Europe will go to the polls and there are predictions that the results could deliver a seismic shock to the European landscape, with up to a third of the votes going to populist, xenophobic, racist, extremist parties, Eurosceptic parties. Big question, what is all that going to mean for the European political landscape? What is it going to mean, and how should mainstream parties respond to that challenge? And crucially, how should foundations, what can foundations do to respond to the political governance challenges that the results are likely to underline? That is what we would like to focus on in this session. The format is very simple. I have three panelists who are going to join me on stage in just a moment. I will ask them some questions just to get our discussion started, and then, like yesterday, I will come out with the microphone and hopefully take questions and comments from all of you. So, first, let me introduce our speakers, and as I do so, I'd like them to come and join me on the stage. Josef Janning, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the Berlin office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Great to see you. Josef and I used to work together. It's great to have you here. Please. Ivan Vejvoda, who is Senior Vice President for Programs at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And Jeta Jara, who is a renowned journalist in Kosovo and the Balkans. She hosts an award-winning current affairs TV program called Life in Kosovo and is country director of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. You go in the middle, Jeta, that's perfect. No speeches, no opening remarks. We're just going to dive in, as I say. I'll ask a few questions to get us started, and then, please, your questions and comments, very welcome. So, as I say, just a few days to go till voting starts. We had a televised debate last night again between the European Commission, the candidates for president, and they were discussing Europe. Josef, if I could start with you, those predictions of the seismic shock, 1/3 of the votes. How do you see the likely outcome, and what implications do you think this has, both in terms of how we see the EU's relations with its citizens, but more broadly on politics in Europe and the response to the challenges we face?
Well, first of all, it will be sort of a shock, even if it's just 25% and not 30 or 33. But this signals a departure. And then the question is, how do the other parties react to this? Do they close ranks and say, well, here are the outcasts and we're the good people, and we continue doing what we have been done? Or do they sit back and think? You know, if they do, they need to rethink what the European Parliament is, and whether it is not actually, or should not actually be, the representation of the people in Europe, the citizens of the European Union. And then this Parliament could say, look, you know, we're a bit more representative now in this unliked combination or constellation than we were before. And we will do our best to actually represent the interests of the people. And we will try to argue better. We'll try to be more convincing in the way that we deal with each other, and not appear, you know, as one block that is kind of representing the idea of Europe against the petty national interests of member states. No? And I think it's about time to rethink the Parliament that way.
So for you, that is one of the crucial aspects here, is because of the way the Parliament is perceived, will be partly responsible for the type of vote, for the way people vote. They will use it as a protest because they don't see the Parliament playing that role in the way they should. Fascinating stuff. We'll come back to that. Ivan, if I could turn to you, and then Jeta, I'd like to get a Balkan perspective on this. But For you, how big is the shock likely to be? Joseph saying there, whatever the numbers, it's going to be a shock. And what do you think the implications are for the future?
Well, definitely a wake-up call to the broad public who is maybe not following things as some of us are here from the quote-unquote expert point of view. But I would say it begs the deeper question, why is this happening? And, the immediate answer I have to that is the rising inequality and the permanent state of inequality in all developed societies where people are suffering, their balance home sheets are weaker and less money in their pockets, which means also less trust in mainstream political parties, and thus the refuges go where somebody's offering so-called simple solutions, which are extremely dangerous because these parties, whatever their result will have a much stronger voice, and that's a voice that basically undermines pluralism because they have the pretense of having the truth. And we know that all those who are carrying the so-called truth with a big T exclude others, and we have seen, unfortunately, in European history not so long ago, where that led. So it's about institutions. We know that the European Parliament is weaker in the grand scheme of things, but that voice will have its weight, obviously. And then at the level of Brussels, at the level of the 28 member states, we'll see how they actually balance out that strong voice and how far that voice will carry.
Interesting, and interesting, you talked there about the inequalities, and there was a Eurobarometer opinion poll only last week, which showed that more people in Europe think the worst is still to come in terms of economic problems and their own prospects for the future than think we are over the worst. So question there, how do you address that? And this perception, and yet a very interesting from those countries who want to join the EU still, that within Europe, voters are seeing the EU as part of the problem and not part of the solution. How does it look from where you're sitting?
Rather than rethink Europe, I'd like to just take a step further and imagine Europe. Imagine if citizens of this city, those who walk down the streets, were allowed to vote in these parliamentary elections. Imagine if citizens of Pristina, Skopje, Tirana, Belgrade, Podgorica were a part of these elections. I think we would make Europe less xenophobic because there'd be less to be Eurosceptic about. So I never believed that I'd hear myself saying that the Balkans may actually keep Europe sane if it was integrated.
Why would there be less to be Europe? What do you mean when you say that?
What I mean, first, is that it's a necessity. It's a necessity. Enlargement of the EU just is a necessity. It's not anymore a comfort and a comfortable kind of debate to have, because the vacuum will be filled by others in the Balkans as it is filled in Ukraine. So there's no other alternative. Enlargement should have happened yesterday, as far as I'm concerned, and it's coming way too late. And I'm not saying this from egocentric point of view, as I'm not naive. I know that, like in Bulgaria and Romania, Europe did not resolve its problems, such as corruption. Corruption still would need to, and rule of law, would need a strong civil society and media in the region to keep pushing and fighting that battle for accountable governance, well beyond EU integration. But the main reason why EU has to include all Western Balkan countries is geopolitical mapping that simply needs to be completed. Something that from First World War I to Second and to the 90s remains, make us feel like players of bigger powers rather than citizens of this big power, Europe. And the Balkans remains basically unfinished job for Europe. Besides, what can 20 million people of the Balkans harm the hundreds of millions of Europe?
Okay. On that question, just to touch briefly on that, and then I want to look at what the impact on mainstream political parties is. But on the enlargement question, we discussed this yesterday, Josef and Ivan, in the context of peace, and what indeed it means, given the statements that enlargement is off the table for the foreseeable future, or for the next 5 years, depending on whether you listen to Martin Schulz or you listen to Jean-Claude Juncker. How important do you think that is, and would you agree with Jette that that sends, I think, a very strange signal about Europe? It made a promise, it doesn't appear to be living up to it. Does that have an impact? Obviously, it has an impact in the Balkans. Does it also have an impact on European voters within their borders? Do politicians need to be a bit braver about this, perhaps? Ivan?
Well, definitely, I fully agree with what Jette said in a very compelling way. If Europe is to be credible at all, the enlargement must happen. Otherwise, I don't see how Europe can be credible in the world as such. Does it impact the vote in 6 days? I don't think it does so much, because everything really is local. In this case, 95%. I mean, it's an old adage that all politics is local and very little is foreign policy. So I think people are really worried about the economic situation, and again, the inequality and the lack of trust in the mainstream politicians.
But that worry about the economic situation has led to all this debate in Europe about so-called welfare tourism, which is one of the reasons why people have become anti-enlargement. So the two things are playing together, are they not? And politicians will say, well, there is no appetite. Not only do we need to get our own house in order, but there is no appetite. The public doesn't want or need any more countries to join now. How do you see that playing afterwards? If we get the seismic shock, Joseph, will it be worse in terms of the European perspective of these countries, or could there be a shift in the debate in the way Jette is suggesting?
I have my doubts, because it's currently I see policymakers trapped in their own promises or in their own rhetoric. Now, on the one hand, they are continuously messaging to their own publics, look, we're protecting your interests. Now, we are looking after the fact that Europe is not taken over. We are helping you deal with the current situation and not allowing Europe to take things out of our hands. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to be brave on enlargement. As Jette has rightly said, the EU should have demanded integration from countries in the Western Balkans. That would have been a major impact on development in the region. But in this kind of environment, there is no chance of this happening. It will rather be a rather muddly, a rather complicated and slow process by which at the end of the day there will be some enlargement, but it will be sort of tolerated or accepted rather than shaped and demanded.
Just to follow up, you talked about being brave. Can I ask you how you think, and then to all of you, how mainstream political parties should react to all of this? There was a very famous Jose Manuel Barroso and usually he's not politically particularly brave, but he told David Cameron once in the chamber of the European Parliament, don't try to copy the leader of the UK Independence Party, the withdrawalist, Nigel Farage, because if people like what he says, they'll vote for the original, not the copy. My question to you is, how does mainstream politics react? Do they react by trying to mimic the populist, which is what most of them seem to do, take on some of the clothes, if not all of them? Do they react by rethinking Europe, by rethinking the way Europe is working? What should the response be to deal with this? A thought from all three of you on that, then I'll bring the audience in and we'll continue the discussion.
Well, clearly to me, Europe needs leadership on Europe. We don't need more leadership of representing more national interests. We need national leaders to come back to the idea of articulating a midterm perspective about what Europe should be, where it should go to. This is the kind of leadership that many people expect from Angela Merkel. Not that Germany rules, but that the German Chancellor has an idea of where Europe should go and is seen as campaigning for this idea among her peers and seeking to build coalitions to get Europe out of this kind of the trap of sovereignism, of standing on one's own position, not moving, and getting into a mood of saying, what is it that we have to do? And in that sense, I think it's not just about shifting things to Brussels, but it's about, for example, launching a major initiative on building governance within the EU member states to a European level, to the quality that European citizens deserve.
Jette?
what you need to be brave about, or Europe needs to be brave about, is one of the biggest problems of political governance that I find to be in the EU. That once you become a member of the EU, the scrutiny and compliance of members with fundamental European values just ceases to exist. Take Hungary, for an example, a country that did best reforms before joining the EU. It had a vibrant NGO sector, managed to recover the post-communist economy, and successfully completed the process of reform that made Hungary an equal member. Today, a neighbor of Western Balkans, 10, 15 years later, it is showing signs that it's destroying civil society, endangering minority rights, pandering to xenophobia, actively narrowing space for free media and freedom of speech, as well as having controlled economy, not the free market economy. All of these in an already existing EU country. So how come EU has allowed itself that among its ranks, it has states with unaccountable governance? So if we really want to rethink Europe, I think we need DG compliance. In the same way that Stefan Füle comes to our capitals and tells us how to be good, how to be in this great club, it needs that type of person to go to some of these countries and really talk about those fundamental values that made you European in the first place. Human rights, just policies, equal opportunities, minority rights, and free media. Without these measures, some sort of mechanism for compliance, Europe will have the rise of right-wing parties, individual countries, that will not cease to exist. These will not cease to exist unless you have pressure, what is like to remind countries to be European. How else can we build that trust if you cannot guarantee the deterioration of quality of democracy in Europe?
Okay. Ivan, a reaction on that, if you would, and on this question of how mainstream politics reacts. You talked about inequalities. Tomorrow, in the closing plenary, we're going to focus on solidarity. What does that mean in a modern context? But also, I mentioned the Eurobarometer poll, and there's a very interesting correlation. Those countries where Eurosceptic parties are most successful are also those countries that are least optimistic that we have come through the worst of the crisis. So if you look, it's Greece, it's Italy, it's France, it's the UK, and it's Hungary. So how do mainstream, do they pander to the fear, if you like, ape the populace, or how can they find a way to give hope and, as I say, turn Europe back into part of the answer?
I'd like to actually pick up the last point that Jette made about the quality of democracy, and that relates directly to mainstream political parties or to mainstream politics in general. I think that people are seeing to use the term very broadly, a corruption of politics, a loss of nobility of politics, which should be really the kratos of the demos, the power of the people. And so when we talk about governance, I think there's a misunderstanding. Governance is not democracy, and I think people feel that they've lost the grip on the rule in their societies. And by that I mean, this blurring of the lines between corporate and political. People see that CEOs of banks have these exorbitant salaries, and they're asking, how come this happens as our salaries are declining? And to your point about mainstream politics, I'd like to make the point that we have 3 major former prime ministers that are either indicted or in jail. We have Berlusconi. In Croatia, we have Ivo Sanader, and just recently, not directly Europe, but Ehud Olmert in Israel has been condemned to 6 years in prison because of corruption while he was mayor of Jerusalem. We need to remind ourselves that Jacques Chirac was being investigated while he was mayor in Paris. Helmut Kohl was about party finances, and I think that's really what's driving the people's reaction to this mainstream politics. They're seeing this strange goings-on, and they feel that something is fishy, to be very jargonesque about it.
So do you interpret the likely results less as a strong anti-European vote, but more of a none of the above? We are sick of our current leadership. They need to clean their act up. They need to deliver for us again. Is that how you see it, more than a straight anti-European vote?
It's a gut reaction. You take Beppe Grillo's 5-star movement in Italy. I think it's exemplary of this. The leader doesn't want to go into politics, yet he runs in the elections to accumulate this vote. People are going there because they don't want to vote for any of these other parties that they either see corrupt or not representing their real interests. So it's really about the quality of democracy, about politics per se. What is it today, and how do I, as a citizen of 18 years old or 60 years old as a retiree, how do I get my interests heard in there? And so these are kind of a bit of catch-all phenomenon of parties.
Yeah, Todd? What do you think? I mean, do you want to react to that, or would you simply agree with his diagnosis of the...
I'll react later
Okay.
after we let some people
Just
speak.
to finish on this question before I go out to the audience, we're talking about the quality of democracy, we're talking about how parties respond. The most likely response people are predicting, because when you say with this huge surge in the populist vote, does that block the business of Europe, because the Parliament now has joint decision-making power? At the very least, you have a very awkward obstructionist presence. Some people say it won't happen. They're such a motley crew. They can't agree with each other about anything. So, yes, there'll be a lot of noise, but it won't amount to much. But other people also predict that we will see at European level a German-style grand coalition, that the centre-right European People's Party and the centre-left progressives and socialists will get together to make sure the business goes on. Do you think that's the most likely thing, Joseph? And if it is, how will the voters read that? Will they read that as, you're not listening? Or will they take it on board because what they want to do is register a protest, they didn't want to stop the wheels of decision-making from turning? How do you think they'll read it, and then going to come out to all of you?
Well, the European Parliament is a rather strange animal already, even before this election, because there is a grand coalition in operation, particularly the two major parties, the Socialists and the European People's Party. They are in agreement over the basic running of the European Parliament, and it shows in the sequence of the President's position, and that they rotate half-time into the legislative period. But in reality, when it comes to the core task of the Parliament, which is co-legislation, the reality in Parliament is that it gives opportunities to a lot of people across party lines. There's a lot of involvement also from the small parties. And actually, it is sort of an informal grand coalition. As long as the people don't notice, that's all right. But once the people start to notice, they want some kind of a political debate. They want to see what are the alternatives, what are the smartest ideas from all those sides. Now, if you have a third of the seats already taken by anti-EU parties, or even strongly xenophobic parties, then it forces the others to kind of block vote much more of the time than they should be. The more people watch what goes on in the European Parliament, the less helpful it will be to see that the rest, the two-thirds, will have to be in agreement most of the time in order to get anything through.
Did I see you want to jump in? Yeah.
Whatever happens with elections, the big picture is what you started talking about, Jackie, that in the end of the day, whatever happens, the immediate challenge is going to be that Europe is going to have to decide whether it wants to come together or get maneuvered by Russia. I don't think there will be much option.
As you mentioned that, I want to ask you, forgive me, for two reasons about the impact of Ukraine. Because we did discuss yesterday whether in a way we were talking about peace as the narrative for Europe, and what is the impact of Ukraine. And Jose Manuel Barroso, and I quoted him yesterday, has argued strongly that this is a moment where we show that narrative is still justified. We cannot take peace for granted. And on Ukraine, before I get you to react to how you think the public may begin to see the purpose of Europe again, could I just mention that there is going to be a statement issued from this conference, the Sarajevo statement, and I just wanted to give you a couple of extracts just so you get a feel for it, and you will get copies at the end of this session. European foundations express their solidarity with Ukraine, and it says, and I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but it says, among other things, that while we're debating here the challenges and needs of the European community, we cannot stop thinking about the current situation in Ukraine. It reminds everyone of the symbolism of meeting here in Sarajevo Sarajevo, and it says that the choice of this place shows we are determined to learn the lessons of the past to contribute to a free and peaceful Europe today and in the future, and expresses concern that the Europe we work for is threatened by recent developments in Ukraine. It instead talks about the inspiration from the people of Ukraine. It talks about fears of the escalation of the conflict and what it may lead to. And it says, the European foundations assembled in Sarajevo stand together in solidarity with the Ukrainian people and civil society. We support those individuals and organizations that are fighting for these values in Russia and other parts of Europe. I just wanted to mention that because very much part of what we're talking about. What impact, briefly if you would, so I can go out to the audience, do you think Ukraine will have in terms of the public's perceptions of what Europe is for? Ivan.
Well, huge. I mean, you use the word seismic for these elections. I mean, Ukraine is a seismic event 25 years after the fall of the wall, which in its own right was a huge earthquake in terms of global politics. And I think this is a kind of major aftershock of that seismic event of 1989. No one saw that it was coming. Some of us who formed part of the former country of which Sarajevo was a part also didn't expect that we would go into full bloodshed after 1989. And this was another wake-up call that history comes back with a vengeance if you are not part of an institutional framework such as the European Union, which has created mechanisms and cushions and checks and balances to avoid the worst. Of course, you can never predict that the worst will be avoided, but at least until today, the European Union has demonstrated that it has been capable, and that's why we all who are not members of it yet want to join and why the enlargement is important. Peace is overriding, and the polls and the last Pew poll that was published on Monday shows it in formidable numbers, and the Ukrainian people in the Maidan wanted to join also because there was a little more certainty and a little more security within the European Union. Nobody is naive about the difficulties of the European Union. Let's stop talking about that. It's really about this minimal guarantee that a union such as the European one provides to people and gets them out of the claws of the dangers that the Ukrainians are living today.
And so you don't see that paradox as well between the popularity of EU membership outside its borders and its lack of popularity, because there is a realism and still the strong feeling. Yet, Josef, impact of Ukraine, and then I'm coming out to all of you.
You want to go first?
It actually makes me angry to see the response, the lack of leadership there is not among, it's the lack of leadership among the EU leaders to not to be able to navigate interests of individual states in Europe, not being able to speak with a common voice, common agenda. Again, like in a crisis such as financial crisis, in Ukraine as well, we see leaders of countries making their own statements, making their own policies rather than the EU. What Ukraine has done is as well exposed maybe the different interests, maybe what the role of civil societies is, and people like me, media, are doing in UK, exposing their own leadership to how much corrupt maybe Russian money there is in cities like London, and pushing their governments. Maybe it's going to activate some civil society in Western Europe to actually have some impact that EU comes up with a very, very strong response. Otherwise, the response has really been not as we would expect to have that peace.
Okay, so some rethinking of Europe in terms of the way we respond, but also among the public, a rethinking of Europe's role, or a reversion, if you like, to the traditional role Europe was seen for. Josef?
Well, it seems to me that a lot of Europeans, particularly in East Central Europe, now really feel what difference it makes to be part of the European Union. To be, to have escaped from that kind of political environment where there actually are no winners, at least not when you look at it from the perspective of the people. Now, it also has a risk for the European Union. That's, I think, a reason why we need to have some water in the wine there. Ukraine is clearly beyond the reach of the European Union. And it would be politically very risky if one would now start to equate, you know, the future of Europe with the question of whether the EU is able to take Ukraine out of Russia's hands. I think Europe and the EU can only lose on this. No, it's a real tragedy for the Ukrainian people. The tragedy is that they have been weakly, poorly, and badly governed, also after the Orange Revolution in 2004, and now have you know, come under the wheels of Russia's ambitions. But the EU cannot stop this. The EU cannot stop this from happening. The EU can only be there and be what it is and be ready to support things whenever people in Ukraine get a second chance.
I want to go out to the audience. I want to come back when I do, in the last part of our discussion, to the role of foundations in all of this. What are the implications for the work that they're doing, the type of projects they support? How do you see, what is your advice for them? But let me first, if we could have the lights up just a tiny bit so I can see if there are any hands in the audience. And you can contribute. It doesn't have to be a question, it can also be a comment. Does anybody want to join the discussion at all? Haki, please reintroduce yourself for those who may not have been here yesterday.
Haki Abazi, Rockefeller Brothers Fund for Western Balkans. I'm shocked the way we will be shocked from actually very skeptical views on where EU is going, and I share that. But I have to say, I'm happy that EU does not have a military, because imagine with this structure how we would manage a military intervention or operations. So thank God for NATO there. One point, I'm really disappointed coming from the Balkans with the kind of view that we cannot do anything about Ukraine, because it leaves us, and EU especially, as an interest-based group for 60 million people market. But when they are in danger, then there are individual kind of more mitigating engagements than actually an articulated EU foreign policy, even to its first neighbor. And this is huge concern about where EU is going.
Okay, thank you. That is an issue I'm sure we will return to tomorrow, because we will be discussing solidarity both within Europe and with countries on our borders and beyond. And we have a professor from Ukraine, so I'm sure we will come back on that issue tomorrow. Any other questions or comments? Hang on a second. Very good for me. I get fit doing this. Thank you.
Goran Svilanovic, Secretary General of the Regional Cooperation Council. I'd actually like to ask a question which might be tricky, therefore I apologize in advance. Could that be that the vote we are going to see in the coming days, we are speaking in advance, therefore it's not very smart, is actually going to be that the vox populi of the core EU is telling us, guys, stop this. We are not willing to pay a price of the enlargement. We are not really happy with what you've done already, and we just want to stop it. Basically agreeing with the Putin's position, it was all a mistake. Collapse of...
So when you say stop it, you don't... When you say stop it, you don't...
They are telling us exactly something that we don't want to hear.
Okay, but wait, just to clarify what you mean, when you say you think the message might be stop it, you mean abolish it, start again, or do you mean don't do any more?
Basically telling us that was a huge mistake, we are not willing to pay economic price or any other price if it means confrontation with Russia. Just stop it. We are happy with the borders. We were maybe happy with the Iron Curtain. So we cannot go back.
So you're not talking about abolishing the EU, you're talking about don't go any further. Okay,
That's it.
Thank you. Let's get a very provocative question there. Is that the message that they will be sending? A reaction on that?
Yes, well, a lot of policymakers already are sensing that. You know, a lot of current European policy is actually administering the status quo. It's not about deeper Europe or wider Europe, but is rather about kind of muddling through with what we have and seeking to reassure the people, look, you know, don't be afraid, it's not going to be any worse. I think it's an inadequate policy response over the midterm. But that's how politicians have a very good sense of the anxieties and fears of people, you know, and so they try a kind of a middle way of not doing a lot of ambitious things, but at the same time not putting aside the Europe rhetoric that they use in these frameworks.
So if the message is stop it, Again, what is the response? That you do stop it, or that you try to make the arguments better, that you try to explain better? Because if some of the stop it is coming from mimicking the populist rhetoric, so accepting the framework, what is the answer? Is it you stop, or is it that you try to change the debate? Ivan?
Well, Joseph is completely right. I mean, a lot of this, or a majority of it, is driven by domestic politics. Politicians need to get re-elected, and they will do everything to do so. And one of the contraptions is to use these xenophobic, basically, arguments. We don't want the Polish plumber, the Slovenian ski instructor, you know, the Bulgarian whatever, and the Romanian that. And then obviously, and we must mention this, the Roma are really at the top of this list of people who are seen as quote-unquote undesirable, and who are the object of a lot of repression and simply repressive behavior by governments, not only by people. And so this fear-mongering that's occurring has impact on the enlargement. And so once the election is over, you have the Brussels machine, in a positive sense, that, you know, there are bureaucrats who come every Monday morning, they open their file on the enlargement of Montenegro, of, you know, Albania, and the rest, and carry on. So you have these different levels. You have a strategic level where Europe has made a commitment and the thing doesn't stop, and yet politicians, through their electoral waves, go through this no enlargement, yes enlargement. And let's not beat around the bush. It's a lot about Turkey, in fact. The fear of Turkey as the probably biggest country coming in. And we must make a distinction there between Western Balkans and Turkey. I think it's really the fear of Turkey when German politicians or French politicians talk about the enlargement being in question.
You remind me when you were talking there about doing anything to get elected of what Jean-Claude Juncker once said, which is, we know what we have to do, we just have no idea how to get elected after we've done it. So that debate that will certainly begin after these elections. Jette, a thought on this, and then I'll see if there are any more questions.
There's just going to have to be a lot of explanations that Europeans have to do to their own audiences, that confrontation with Russia is inevitable if you don't enlarge. So I don't accept the stop it. In fact, what's happening in Ukraine is an argument why you cannot stop enlargement. Suddenly it brought an edge to the argument, to the tiredness of Europe. And if you use the data of how much has the Polish plumber actually harmed or improved the economies of Western Europe, I think you've got it all, but it just takes the bravery to not hide between tabloids and not pander to tabloids, but explain what is going on in Ukraine to your own audiences and just really go by the book explaining what do Russians mean by what they're doing there.
Okay, I want to come back on the role of foundations in all of this in a moment, but any other questions or comments from all of you before we focus on that? Ta-da. Yes, sorry, didn't see you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Di Maria from Italy. I play in a bit the devil's advocate, but not that much actually. I think that you can hardly define that the Union's economic policy making and foreign policy in the recent years as unqualified successes. What it seems to me is that the leadership at the Union level seem to be unable even to make promises. That's what politicians do all the time, but they seem unable to do even that. And if you don't show a goal, if you don't promise something connected to the goal, how can you have the interest of people be reborn?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any last ones before we move to the role of foundations? This, or indeed if you have a question on that topic. Okay, let's come back. So, we've assessed what all this might mean for Europe, but in terms of rethinking Europe, in terms of the political governance challenge that we've been discussing, what do you think the implications are in all of this for foundations, the sort of work they do, the projects that they support, and how they can work with governments, with other civil society actors on these issues? Do you have some advice for them on what all of this might mean? Who would like to? Joseph.
Well, I've got two issues. The one issue is to not stop at appealing to politics on Europe. Now, this is something very easy for foundations to say, you should, Europe must. But engage and support hard thinking about the future of Europe. Support the generation of ideas, of strong ideas, of compelling ideas. Not of wishful thinking, but of things that actually could be done. In order to strengthen the discourse on what Europe should achieve, what Europe should aim for. Second thing is build a European public space. With this Eurozone debt crisis, we have seen an enormous increase in the talking about Europe and about how things are elsewhere. But there's very little talking with each other. So do whatever you can to bring people together from all walks of life to discuss Europe.
And from different countries
Different
coming
countries,
together.
yes, coming together.
Have that pan-European
Yeah, but do it
debate.
local, do it on local spots, bring people from other localities of Europe to another locality, do kind of a European town hall, be local and European at the same time, and discuss Europe with it.
Ivan, what can foundations do that we've talked about the mainstream political reaction to all of this? What can they do that the parties can't, if you like, that where's the gap and how can they help to fill it?
Well, a lot. And I think this meeting here in Sarajevo is a great example of what they can do, is simply to bring the big questions to the fore, to ask why to rethink democracy. I mean, we shouldn't shy away from the big questions. Yes, foundations have their division of labor, from social to economic to think tank to economic and other aspects, but I think asking the hard questions is one of the big things. And of course, that will lead to avenues that will feed ideas, as Joseph said. I was just last Monday, the American Community Foundation, the Cleveland Foundation, celebrated its 100th anniversary, a big milestone in foundation life globally and the US. And we had a dinner with CEOs of the major American foundations. And it was a very open discussion about the next 100 years. It was kind of a great question to ask. And the CEO of the Cleveland Foundation asked a very pointed and dramatic question. He said, "We, American Foundation, never questions the use of $3 trillion for the Iraq war. If someone had said, soybeans will invest $3 trillion, everybody would be up in arms in the public American space." And so in a very dramatic way, he asked, how do we govern from the public space? And Joseph, I've been an advocate of this European public space. Hard questions need to be asked. One might say, well, this is not the business of foundations to meddle in foreign policy. But yes, it is. And we're doing so here by opening the question of Ukraine, of enlargement, and the rest. Not that every foundation will be able to do this. But I think if we are aware of the question, we will be able to have a division of labor, a plurality of activity that will contribute to finding the solution. And I think the plurality of actors on the scene, political, civil society, foundation, economic, corporate, is really where the answers lie. Not one single actor can actually find a response to the kinds of questions that you're asking us about mainstream politics. It's really about creating those alliances between actors where we may aspire and think that we will make a few steps forward. But there is no ideal solution. One of the founding persons or fathers of the European Union said, there will be no grand gates we will go through. There will be many small gates that we will work through. And so I think, I don't call that a minimalist approach. I call that a realist approach, but a can-do approach. We mustn't be with our arms down, but standing up and really forcefully saying where we want to go. And, to the question about the promise of politicians in Europe, there is one promise they made, that they will enlarge to the Western Balkans and to Turkey, by the way. And I think if that promise cannot be kept, given all the conditions that we have to meet, then we're really not worthy of the conversation that we're having.
And it goes to the heart of that credibility question.
Yeah.
Jetta?
For me, from where I'm sitting, as a civil activist and journalist in the Balkans, the role of foundation is key. And I have a list of to do and not to do. Basically, I think it's key to keep supporting accountable, strong, truthful, and engaging civil society. as a safeguard to European values. That is before and after integration. Don't give up on civil society in Europe, since we're talking about Europe, before and after, because pushing for an accountable governance and strong civil society is something that should not stop with EU integration, such as we've seen the case of Hungary. Choose the right people. So what not to do is don't engage with fake NGOs, I guess we should say straight ahead. Don't engage only with people who speak your language and who say what you want to hear, and don't engage only with the usual suspects. Please create space for fresh blood in civil society, and that is not such a rocket science, I guess.
Thank you very much. Are there any other don'ts? I mean, we were talking yesterday about in terms of peace and so on, there are areas where they can play a role, and there are areas where really you have to step back. Ivan.
I'd like to come back to Sarajevo, actually. Yeah. And, we're holding this meeting, the Annual General Assembly here, and there are a lot of foundations here sitting in the room that are doing work in this area of Europe that is as yet unintegrated. And yet, I'm sure there are many more others who are not doing anything. And so I think if we're serious about Europe, and this is the European Foundation Center, then however minimally, I think everybody should make an effort to help this unfinished business here. To not only integrate, but to lift the level of society and social work. Again, there is formidable work that is being done by quite a few foundations. But I think if we're here, we should be here also for a reason, not only to talk, but to show the commitment and solidarity that you will talk about in the third session. And obviously, we need to solve problems like, water supply in the whole world, or electricity to the 400 million people in India that don't have it. But if we're not able to make a mark at home, by which I mean Europe, then we won't be worthy of those other places.
Okay, thank you. Joseph.
Yeah. I think adding to what Ivan said, I think one of the good things to do is to try to get as many young people from this region to go elsewhere in Europe as possible, not to missionize them or to preach to them, but to let them make their own experiences about what they would want to see in their own home cities, in their own hometowns, to give them an agenda to work for. And I think this is a very significant contribution that foundations can make. And if I can add one more thought, Jackie, I think foundations should also dare in what they do is to compete with each other. There is a certain instinct among foundations to say, no, let's cooperate, no, let's join forces. I think in a pluralist environment, if you want a vital debate, you want more than one provider of ideas. I think if foundations can contribute to a very vital debate about Europe, which means more than one strong idea, more than one strong position, it will be for the good of Europe.
But also the idea behind collaboration, playing devil's advocate on that, is you get more bang for your bucks.
Sure.
If you all work together on something. Yes. And you mentioned working together, and you talked about young people, brings to mind a reception I chaired last night for the European Fund for the Balkans, and we heard from some young people here, right across the Balkans, talking about networks and communities, and that going across borders that had been so important for them. So I want to try and sort of now focus down in the last 5 minutes on some recommendations. And I want to do twofold. You've given quite a lot of ideas about what you think foundations could and couldn't do. I'm going to do something very unfair, which is to say, if you had, I don't know, let's pick a sum, €1 million. You were a foundation with €1 million to spend on something related to political governance and meeting these challenges we've been discussing. What would you put that money into? It's a really mean question. But also, before we get to that one, so it gives you a moment or two to think, in terms of your recommendation to Europe's leaders. So when they get together on the Monday morning after we have the results of the elections a week on Sunday night, what is the first thing they need to do as they respond to these election results? What signals should they send? What should their message be? And I'm going to come down the line, and we'll do, for the message, I'll come this way, and then for your recommendation of how to spend that €1 million, I'll go that way. So, Ivan first.
on the council meeting on Monday.
Yeah, what should leaders do in response to these elections? The first thing they do.
Well, I mean, to be realistic, I don't think they'll do anything different than they'll be doing other Monday mornings when they meet in the council. So, you know, we can dream and hope that
Let's dream.
Okay. Well, more leadership. I mean, frankly, I mean, we've seen the kind of weak choices that have been made in the leadership of Europe, and we know all the reasons for this because the capitals of the big countries of Europe want to hold their grip on the main decision making, and thus they want somebody, quote unquote, malleable, who will not stick out and kind of take the lead. You know, the last person we remember was Jacques Delors, who really kind of led the European Union in a certain direction. Some weren't happy with that. So I think, well, the minimal thing that I would like to see is really that they have a hard look at each other and to define policies, because just to go back to one another poll question that we do at the German Marshall Fund, the Transatlantic Trends, we asked a very broad question: do you think you live in a just society? And although in all other questions you get all sorts of differences, here from the United States to Sweden, across all European countries, the majority of people think they live in unjust societies. Very simply, that the societies benefit the wealthy and do not benefit those who are not wealthy. And I think that's really the big question from which all of these questions arise. And so how does one try to make a society somewhat more just? There's no such thing as full equality. The societies will always be unequal, but they have to be less unequal. I think that's the major question.
Thank you. And that, Ivan, we will return to tomorrow in our discussion on solidarity. Jette.
Do something about Ukraine the next morning, much bigger than what EU is doing right away, I would say, or get maneuvered by Russia. Simply start cutting all economic ties with Russia. I know it's easier said than done, but start working on it right away. Cut the ties and reach out to civil society in Ukraine and offer some sort of mechanism. I don't know EU institutions enough to tell you exactly what it is, but there must be some space. EU is a success for peace. They must have a system, mechanism, which you could offer to Ukraine that's not immediate integration into it.
Joseph.
If they did this, they would lose the great majority of the European citizens, or the citizens of the EU, because they are not of that opinion. No.
We don't know about Ukraine, what opinion they are.
They are not.
Okay, we're going to come back on Ukraine again tomorrow, so let's not.
No, it's not about you.
No.
They're not about a showdown with Russia.
No.
That's not
Not
the
a
majority
showdown.
of the people. If you break off all economic
not
relations.
saying
Okay,
go to
I'm going to stop the argument about Ukraine now, because we have about 2 minutes left, and I want you to give your recommendation foundations. What should they do in a sentence, Joseph, the morning after
I'll
the
escape
elections?
that question by saying the first thing they should do is try to find 4 of us to also give $1 million. Because it's $1 million to do something along the lines we've been talking about is not much.
I plucked a number out of the air.
Yeah.
What I really was saying, if you had to identify a project, an area to focus on for foundations, what for you would it be? In a sentence each, because that's all we have time for. Joseph.
Then it would be my idea about the people-to-people, strengthening the people-to-people debate about Europe.
Jette.
I would say invest in a project which follows the money, in investigative journalism type of project from Ukraine to Hungary and the Balkans, simply kind of projects that would follow the money of the governments, how they spend it, and what they do with it. Offer scrutiny on the most sensitive and most controversial issue, how the money is spent.
Ivan, you have the last word.
One of the secrets of the success of the European Union was the French-German reconciliation after World War II, which meant investing a lot in young people from both sides to go and visit each other, study each other. So my investment would be into the young people, the unemployed, the disinherited youth of Europe, and whether through community foundation work or through connecting them. The power of connection is huge. The more the younger generation meets between each other and recognize that they have identical problems, I think the better it will be for all of us, because that's where the future lies.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel? I wish we could meet again in 10 days' time and have this discussion when we know the outcome, but thank you so much for that. Thank you for your questions.